When I was clearing out my late husband's woodshop, I found a locked metal box inside his old tool chest, buried under drill bits and sandpaper, and 40 years of accumulated hardware. On the lid, in his handwriting on a strip of masking tapes, it said, "For Millie. Open when you're ready. Open alone." I was not ready, but I opened it anyway. My name is Millicent Joan Fowler, and I am 69 years old. I spent 41 years married to a man named Harlan, who built furniture by hand in a workshop behind our house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and who never once in 4 decades raised his voice at me, even when I deserved it. We had 1 son and 1 daughter. We had a vegetable garden that never produced as much as we hoped, and a beagle named Sergeant who outlived his good behavior by about 6 years, and a life that was, by any honest measure, a good one. Harlan died in October. A stroke. He was in the shop when it happened, which is the only place he ever truly wanted to be. The paramedics told me he had likely lost consciousness before he reached the floor. I have held on to that. Not because it makes it easier, exactly, but because it is the kind of detail that gives a person something specific to hold. After the memorial, after my daughter flew back to Austin, and the neighbors stopped leaving food on the porch, and the house got quiet in a way I had never experienced in 41 years of marriage, I began the work of sorting through Harlan's things. There is no way to prepare for it. Every object is a conversation with someone who is no longer there to finish his sentence. The half-finished rocking chair in the corner of the shop. The reading glasses in 3 different rooms because he never remembered where he'd set them. The to-do list on the refrigerator, his handwriting, items he would never complete. I left that list up for 2 months before I finally took it down. It was on a Thursday in January, 3 months after Harlan died, that I went into the shop to begin going through his tools. I had been avoiding it. The shop smelled like him more than any other room in the house, cedar and linseed oil and sawdust, and I had found that I could only take so much of that smell at a time before I had to leave. I was sorting through the chest he kept by the back wall, the old red Craftsman his father had given him, when I found the box on the lowest shelf, tucked behind a coffee can full of miscellaneous screws. It was a small metal lockbox, gray, the kind sold at hardware stores for keeping documents fireproof. The masking tape label on the lid, his handwriting, "For Millie. Open when you're ready. Open alone." I stood there for a long time. My first thought was that it was insurance documents or a copy of the will. My second thought was that I did not know why it needed to be opened alone, and that the word alone was doing something I didn't fully understand yet. Harlan had never been a secretive man, or so I had believed. I brought the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. Then I made a pot of coffee I didn't drink, and I sat across from it as though we were having a conversation. I found the key on the 3rd day. I wasn't looking for it. It was taped to the underside of the second shelf in his desk drawer, a small brass key no bigger than my thumbnail, with a piece of paper wrapped around it that said simply, "You'll know when." I did not know when, but I unlocked the box that evening. Inside I found 3 things: a folded letter in Harlan's hand, a manila envelope sealed with a strip of tape, and a USB drive with a piece of masking tape on it that said "Bank. Start here." I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter with the overhead light on and the rest of the house completely dark. He had written 5 pages. The handwriting was slower than his usual, more careful, the way his penmanship got when he was writing something he needed to get exactly right. He had discovered, 14 months before his stroke, that our son and our daughter-in-law had been quietly moving money out of a joint savings account we had maintained since 1993. The account had been set up to provide for my retirement in the event that Harlan went first. Our son had been added as a secondary holder years ago after Harlan had a brief health scare, a practical arrangement that had made sense at the time. What had not made sense, what Harlan had discovered by accident when he noticed a discrepancy in a quarterly statement, was that the account balance had dropped by nearly $200,000 over the preceding 3 years. Transfers. Regular, moderate-sized, structured carefully enough to avoid automatic flags. Routed through an LLC registered in our daughter-in-law's name, which she had set up through her accounting firm and never mentioned to either of us. Harlan had not confronted them. He had been afraid of what it would do to the family, to our grandchildren, to the relationship between me and my son, which he knew was the one I would find hardest to lose. He had been, he wrote, a coward about it, and he was sorry. But he had documented everything, every transfer, every account statement, the registration papers for the LLC, printed emails he had managed to access through an account recovery on our shared home computer, emails between our daughter-in-law and a contact she referred to by initials, discussing the movement of assets and the need to finalize transfers before things get complicated on your end. That phrase, before things get complicated on your end. The email was dated 9 months before Harlan's stroke. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know how long I was there. At some point, the coffee maker beeped because I had set a timer I didn't remember setting. I got up, poured a cup, and sat back down at the table like a person who was functioning normally, which is a thing you can do even when nothing inside you is functioning normally at all. I should have told you while I was alive, he had written near the end of the letter. I kept thinking I would figure out the right way, and there was no right way, and then there was no more time. You are stronger than I ever was about this kind of thing. Trust that. Trust yourself. I held the letter for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, January was doing what January does in Knoxville, gray and cold and unapologetic. I thought about Harlan in that shop, printing those statements, documenting everything alone, carrying this for 14 months. That image hurt me in a place I hadn't expected. Then I opened the manila envelope. The documentation was, as Harlan had said, thorough. He had been a man who built furniture. He understood that things needed to fit together exactly, that a joint either held or it didn't, and that the difference between the two was always in the preparation. 12 months of account statements. The LLC registration bearing our daughter-in-law's maiden name. A printed chain of emails spanning 8 months, and a handwritten ledger in Harlan's careful script, cross-referencing each transfer amount with the corresponding date and receiving account. The total was $194,000. I put everything back in the envelope and closed the box and went to bed. I did not sleep, but I lay in the dark and I thought about what I was going to do. And by the time the gray January light came through the curtains, I had an answer. I was not going to call my son. I was not going to call my daughter-in-law. I was not going to tell anyone in my family what I had found until I had spoken to someone who was not part of my family at all. In the morning, I called my oldest friend, Winifred Oakes. No, that name is taken. My oldest friend, whose name I will give as Roberta, that name too. My oldest friend Cecile, no. I want to be accurate about this, so let me simply say, I called the woman who had been my closest friend for 32 years, a woman I had met in a hospital waiting room in 1991 when our husbands were both in surgery on the same afternoon for different reasons, and who had sat beside me for 4 hours without knowing my name and had simply been a steady, sensible presence, which is her defining quality. I will call her June, because that is not far from wrong. June had been a legal secretary for 26 years before she retired. She knew things. June listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds, and then she said, "You need an attorney who does not know your family, your son's families, or anyone in their professional circle. Call today, not tomorrow." I called that afternoon. The attorney I found was a woman named Harriet Aldcroft, who had practiced estate and probate law in Knoxville for 24 years, and whose online reviews described her, in one instance that I found particularly useful, as someone who does not enjoy being underestimated. I had the same quality. I thought we might get along. I met with her that Friday. She listened with the focused stillness of someone who has heard many versions of this kind of story and has learned that the variations in detail matter. When I finished, she opened the manila envelope and spent 12 minutes reviewing the contents without saying anything. Then she said, "Mrs. Fowler, what you have here is not a suspicion. It is a record." I exhaled something I had been holding since Thursday night. She explained what would need to happen. A formal challenge to the account modifications on the grounds that I had not provided consent. A full audit request. A referral to the state's Financial Crimes Division. The process, she said, would not be quick, but the documentation Harlan had assembled was, in her professional estimation, unusually complete. He was a craftsman, she said, almost to herself, reviewing the ledger. He built this the way you'd build a piece of furniture, every joint accounted for. I felt something tighten in my chest that took me a moment to identify. It was pride. Even then, even in that office with that folder on that table, I was proud of him. I drove home and tried to settle back into the rhythm of my days. It lasted 4 days. My daughter-in-law called on a Tuesday. She called regularly since Harlan's death, always solicitous, always organized, always asking the right questions in a slightly wrong way. How are you managing the paperwork? Has the estate attorney been in touch? Are there any financial accounts that still need to be sorted? I had answered each of these questions with careful vagueness and had not registered what that pattern of questions meant until I found the box. Now I heard them differently. On that Tuesday, her tone had shifted, still warm, but with something compressed inside it, like a house before a storm. "Mom," she said. She had called me that since the first year of her marriage to my son, and I had been ambivalent about it from the beginning. I was thinking about coming over this weekend to help go through Harlan's shop and studio, just to make sure everything is properly organized before the estate closes. The shop. The studio. The exact rooms where a person might keep a lockbox. I said I had already been through the shop. A brief pause. "Oh, did you find what you needed?" I said I found everything I was looking for. Another pause, slightly longer than the first. "Of course. I just want to make sure nothing gets lost in the shuffle. These transitions can be overwhelming." I told her I appreciated that, and I ended the call, and I stood in Harlan's kitchen with my hands still on the phone and my heart doing something unpleasant in my chest. She didn't know, but she was beginning to wonder if I knew. There is a difference between those two things, and she had just revealed which side of it she was on. I called Harriet Aldcroft's office the following morning and told her about the call. "Good," she said. "Stay consistent. Do not indicate what you have or haven't found. Don't withdraw, but don't volunteer anything." I said I understood. "And Mrs. Fowler," she paused. "If anyone asks to access any remaining accounts or documents before the estate is fully settled, the answer is that your attorney is handling it." That became my answer for the next 3 weeks. My son called 6 days later. Not my daughter-in-law. My son, which told me she had made a calculation that a son calling his mother would land differently. She wasn't entirely wrong. My son's voice, even when it was doing something I didn't like, was still the voice I had known for 43 years. Still the voice that had called from the hospital at 2 in the morning when his youngest was born, terrified and overjoyed in equal measure. "Mom." He sounded measured, practiced. "We've heard you've been consulting with an attorney about the estate." I said I had retained an attorney, yes. I just want to understand what's going on. We've been trying to help. We've been trying to be there for you. I said I knew that. Then why are we finding out about this from someone at the bank instead of from you? I made a note of that. The bank. They had a contact at the bank who had told them an audit had been initiated. That was how they knew. I filed it away and kept my voice even. "My attorney is handling the estate," I said. "If there are questions, she's the right person to answer them." "Mom." His voice dropped. Became something more like the voice I actually recognized underneath the managed version. "What do you think we did?" I said, "I think you know what I found, or you wouldn't be asking me that." Silence. "Whatever you think you found," he said, and his voice was different now, tighter. "That is not the full picture. There were conversations with Dad. There were arrangements. Karen and I were trying to protect the family's future. The market has been brutal, and we have 2 kids in college, and Dad understood." "Your father," I said, "is not here to tell me what he understood. But he left me something that tells me what he knew, and those are not the same thing." The silence on the other end had a different quality this time, the quality of someone who has just understood that the territory has shifted under them. Then my daughter-in-law's voice came on. She had been there the whole time, listening. Millie. Her voice was controlled, smooth, the voice she used with difficult clients, I imagined. "I think there's been a real misunderstanding here, and I don't want this to become adversarial when it doesn't need to be. Karen and Harlan had a very trusting relationship. He was completely in the loop on everything. Then you'll be able to demonstrate that, I said to the auditors. A pause. If you pursue a formal process, she said, and her voice dropped slightly, not louder but more deliberate, you are going to do damage to this family that cannot be undone. Is that what you want? At this point in your life, with everything you're already going through, do you want to spend the next year in attorneys' offices and courtrooms? At this point in your life. I recognized the strategy. She was telling me I was old and tired and not worth the fight. She was counting on grief making me soft. She had misread what grief had made me. I want what my husband spent 14 months documenting, I said. If you have something to say about the process, say it to my attorney. Please don't call me directly again. I ended the call. I sat in the kitchen for a while after that. My hands, when I looked at them, were still. I found that surprising, and then I found it encouraging, and then I put the kettle on and called June. June listened to the whole thing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She called you Millie, she said. I said yes. She's never called you that before. She always calls you Mom. I hadn't noticed. But June was right. She had switched to my name the moment she stopped performing warmth and started performing pressure. Even in her intimidation, she had slipped. She's frightened, June said. People who aren't frightened don't switch scripts. A letter arrived 3 days later. Hand-delivered, which required my son to drive to my house and put it in my mailbox without knocking. I found it on my morning walk. The fact that he had not knocked told me a great deal about the nature of things between them. He was driving and delivering. She was drafting and directing. The letter was professionally worded. It proposed a private resolution. A payment of $60,000, framed as a voluntary family gift, in exchange for my withdrawal of all formal proceedings. It described this as an opportunity to preserve family relationships and avoid a painful and public process. And near the end, there was a line I read twice. At this stage of your life, a prolonged legal proceeding may cost you more in time and energy than the resolution would justify. At this stage of your life, again. The same phrase she had used on the phone. It was a strategy, not an insult, but it was also a miscalculation. $60,000 against $194,000 taken. Less than a third. That is not an offer from someone who believes they are in the right. That is an offer from someone who is afraid of what a courtroom will find. I brought the letter to Harriet. She read it without expression. Then she set it down. They're scared, she said. I said I had come to the same conclusion. They'll escalate before they settle, she said. That's typical. Be prepared for that. She was right. The escalation came on a Saturday morning in March, 3 weeks after I had formally rejected the letter through Harriet's office. I was in the kitchen making oatmeal when my son's car pulled into the driveway. I recognized it before he was out of it. My daughter-in-law was with him. I noticed she was carrying a small white bakery bag. She knew I liked the almond croissants from the place on Market Street. The bag sat on my coffee table for the entire visit without being opened. Neither of us mentioned it. They sat on the sofa. I sat in Harlan's chair. I had put the kettle on before they knocked, because having something to do with your hands is useful, and I poured myself tea and did not offer them any. My son spoke first. He was sorry, he said. He was sorry for how things had become. He and his wife had been under significant financial pressure. The economy, interest rates, the cost of 2 college tuitions simultaneously. He had told himself the money would be repaid before it was ever needed, that it was a temporary arrangement, that Harlan had understood the spirit of it, even if the paperwork hadn't reflected it exactly. He did not use the word theft. He used words like borrowed and informal and family understanding. He did not make eye contact while he spoke. He looked at the coffee table, at his hands, at the window. He had always done that as a child when he was telling me something that wasn't fully true. He would look at everything except the person he was talking to. Then my daughter-in-law leaned forward. Her voice shifted, softer, more intimate, a register she had selected specifically for this conversation. Millie, I know how hard this year has been. Losing Harlan, going through all of this alone. The last thing any of us want is for you to spend what should be a time of healing in courtrooms and depositions. You deserve peace. You deserve to be with your grandchildren, with your family, not buried in legal proceedings. If you drop this, we can work something out between us. Something fair. Something that doesn't hurt anyone. I thought about the word fair. I thought about how easily it comes to people who have taken something that wasn't theirs, how they reach for it like a tool they are entitled to use. I thought about Harlan in the shop, alone, printing those bank statements, writing in that ledger in his careful hand, building the case because he didn't know how to use it while he was living. He had done that work in silence. For me. I was not going to let it mean nothing. The amount your documentation shows was transferred, I said, is $194,000. The offer in your letter was $60,000. When you say something fair, what number are you proposing? My daughter-in-law's expression moved almost imperceptibly, like a small shift in a floorboard. This isn't a negotiation in your living room. No, I said, it isn't. It's a question about what you mean by fair, since that word seems important to you. My son started to speak. She touched his arm. One small, quick gesture. He stopped. He had been stopping every time she made that gesture for as long as I'd been paying attention. I had not always paid attention. I was paying attention now. We came to offer you a way out of this, she said. The warmth was gone now. Not all at once, but the way a season changes, gradually and then completely. I think you should consider it carefully. Once this goes further, there's no version of it that doesn't hurt everyone. I understand, I said. I think you should go. My son looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not past me, not at the floor, but at me. For a moment he looked like the boy who had come down with strep throat every February for 6 years running, and who had slept in my bed when the fever got bad, and who had held my hand once when I was sick, 6 years old and very serious, and told me he would take care of things. I still remembered the weight of his small hand over mine. Then he looked away. My daughter-in-law stood first. She picked up the bakery bag from the coffee table, the croissants still inside, and tucked it under her arm with a deliberateness that was, I thought, the most honest thing she had done all morning. She was not leaving them as a gesture. She was taking back what she brought. They drove away. I sat in Harlan's chair for a long time. What I felt was not confidence. It was something more complicated. There was fear in it, a clear-eyed understanding that these two people had the means and the motive to make the next several months difficult. But underneath the fear was something harder. Harlan had been afraid too. His fear had cost both of us 14 months of a truth we deserved to share. I had made a different choice. I intended to keep making it. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday in May in a civil courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Knox County Courthouse. Harriet spent the weeks before it preparing me with the precision she brought to everything. We reviewed the documentation repeatedly. She walked me through the transfer sequence, the LLC registration, the email chain, the account modifications. She told me what to expect from the opposing attorney, a man named Brant Fullerton, who worked primarily in commercial real estate disputes and whose familiarity with estate fraud law was, she said, with characteristic understatement, limited. She also told me what to expect from myself. You may feel the urge to explain things that don't need to be explained, she said. You may feel the urge to be kind when kindness isn't what the moment requires. The evidence is the evidence. You don't need to perform anything. Just be present. I dressed carefully that morning, a charcoal blazer over a white blouse, low heels, because I have learned over 69 years that comfort matters when you are going to spend several hours being very still and very focused. I arrived before my son and daughter-in-law and found my seat next to Harriet. I folded my hands in my lap and I waited. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, with the particular fluorescent stillness of a room where serious things happen without drama. The judge was a man in his early 60s with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, which I found humanizing. He had, I imagined, sat in this room and heard versions of this story before. That was its own kind of reassurance. They came in together. My daughter-in-law wore a dark suit that projected competence. My son walked slightly behind her, the way he always did now. Brant Fullerton settled in beside them with the ease of a man who had not yet assessed his disadvantage. Fullerton opened on their behalf with what Harriet had predicted: an assertion that the account transfers had occurred with Harlan's full knowledge and verbal agreement, that this was a family financial arrangement, and that my challenge represented a misunderstanding of my late husband's intentions. He was fluent. He was confident. He was working without a foundation. Harriet's opening was quieter and took half the time. She laid the documentary record in chronological order. No editorializing, just the numbers, the dates, the documents, and the sequence they told. I watched the judge's face as she went through each exhibit. His expression did not change, but his pen moved steadily across his notepad, and it moved more consistently when Harriet was speaking. The first recess came after 2 hours. I stood in the hallway with Harriet and drank water from a paper cup. Through the windows at the end of the corridor, the May sky was doing what it does in Tennessee, in May, purely, stubbornly blue. I thought about the vegetable garden at home, which I had planted for the first time without Harlan, and which was doing better than I expected. When proceedings resumed, my daughter-in-law was called to testify. She was composed, careful, consistent, the way a person is when they have rehearsed. She spoke of Harlan with affection that she produced like a document, on demand, exactly as required. She said their relationship had been open, trusting, collaborative. She used the word family regularly and with precision. Harriet cross-examined her with the email chain. 3 emails, specifically. The ones that mentioned completing transfers before things get complicated on your end. Can you explain, Harriet said, how the phrase "things get complicated on your end" is consistent with a voluntary, openly discussed family arrangement? My daughter-in-law said the language was informal, shorthand, not indicative of any concealment. Harriet showed her the next email. In this message, you described the second account as fully insulated. What were you insulating it from? My daughter-in-law said it was business language, real estate practice. Standard phrasing. This is not a real estate account, Harriet said. This is a retirement savings account in Millicent Fowler's name. The room held a particular quality of silence. Even Fullerton was still. My daughter-in-law's composure held for another 20 minutes. It was the modification form that fractured it, a form requiring my COA authorization that the records showed had been filed without my signature. Harriet placed it on the table and asked my daughter-in-law to identify the signature in the co-authorization line. She said it was possible there had been a processing error. Harriet asked whether she was familiar with the statute regarding unauthorized signatures on financial documents under Tennessee law. For the first time, my daughter-in-law's eyes moved. Not to Harriet, not to the judge, to my son. It was a small movement, involuntary, the reflex of someone who has run through all their prepared responses and is reaching for a lifeline. My son was looking at the table. He did not look back at her. That moment, her turning toward him and finding nothing there, was, I thought, its own kind of verdict. My son was called next. His testimony was the testimony of a man trying to hold 2 different versions of the same story together at the same time. He confirmed the verbal agreement narrative. But when Harriet asked him to describe the specific conversation in which Harlan had agreed to the transfers, the date, the location, who else had been present, his account diverged from his wife's in 3 places. When Harriet pointed this out, setting both accounts side by side on her legal pad, my son looked at the table. He had been doing that all day. Mr. Fowler, Harriet said, did your father, in your direct presence, explicitly authorize the transfer of funds from his personal retirement savings account to the limited liability company registered in your wife's name? My son was quiet for 8 seconds. I counted. He understood what we were doing, he said finally. That is not what I asked, Harriet said. The room was very still. Outside, somewhere past the courthouse windows, the May afternoon continued without us. The ruling came 5 weeks later. I was in Harriet's office when her paralegal brought in the document. Harriet read it without expression, which was simply her professional manner and had ceased to alarm me. Then she looked up. Full restitution, she said. $194,000 plus your legal costs. The court has also forwarded the referral to the state's Financial Crimes Division. I sat with that for a moment. The signature on the modification form, she continued, has been identified by the court as an unauthorized signature. That finding has been forwarded to the district attorney. That's a criminal matter, I said. It will be prosecuted separately from the civil judgment, yes. I did not feel elation. I had not expected to. What I felt was something closer to the resolution of a long-sustained pressure, the way a house feels, I imagined, when a structural repair is finally completed and everything settles back to where it was supposed to be. Not triumphant, just right. The way things feel when they return to the position they should have held all along. Harriet slid a copy of the ruling across the desk. I read the operative paragraph the way Harlan had always told me to read a contract. Not for what it says, but for what it commits to. The language was unambiguous. The court had found in favor of Millicent Joan Fowler on all primary counts. I thanked Harriet. She accepted this in her usual manner, which was to move immediately to the next practical matter. "Your husband built you a very strong case," she said. "He built everything carefully," I said. "He just waited too long to show me this particular thing." She looked at me for a moment. "You didn't wait." The civil judgment was enforceable immediately. Their attorney filed a motion to delay enforcement. The court allowed 90 days. Harriet told me this was standard, and that given my daughter-in-law's professional assets, there was no real question of ability to pay, only willingness, and willingness, she said, was no longer the operative variable. My daughter-in-law's accounting license came under review by the state board within a month of the criminal referral. I had not sought that outcome specifically. It was a consequence of the process, not a target I had set. But she had used her professional standing, her knowledge of how money moves through accounts and entities, to do what she had done systematically over 3 years. The license had not been incidental. It had been instrumental. My son called me once after the ruling. I answered because he was still my son, and I was not entirely sure what that meant now, but I knew it meant something. Some things persist past the point where they are comfortable. Parenthood is one of them. He sounded tired. Not the performed tiredness of someone managing an impression, but the real kind. The kind that comes from months of holding something together that keeps coming apart. "Mom," he said, then stopped. "Tried again. I knew it wasn't right. I told myself it would get paid back before you ever needed it. I told myself Dad was getting older and would never notice, and that it was just money." "Don't," I said. "Don't make it something smaller than it was." He didn't argue. That, at least, was honest. "I love you," I said, "and what you did was a serious betrayal." "I'm not going to pretend one of those things cancels the other," he said. "I know." I ended the call. My daughter came to Knoxville 2 weeks after the ruling. I had told her before the hearing because she deserved to know, and because I was done managing information in ways that served no one. She had been quiet for a long time when I told her. A specific kind of quiet that I recognized as someone reorganizing their understanding of something they thought they already understood. Then she said she was coming. That was all she needed to say. We sat on the back porch that first evening, 2 glasses of sweet tea on the rail between us, the yard doing what yards do in May in Tennessee, green and unconcerned with human difficulty. The dogwood along the fence that Harlan had planted 12 years ago was in its second bloom. He had never entirely figured out the pruning schedule, and every year it grew a little sideways and a little overlong and completely alive. My daughter said, "Dad would have liked Harriet." I said he would. He respected people who did careful work. We sat with that for a while. There is a quality to early summer evenings in Tennessee that I have never been able to describe to anyone who hasn't lived through one. Something in the air, the way the heat softens at dusk, the sound of the neighborhood settling in. I had taken it for granted for 41 years. I did not take it for granted that evening. I kept the lockbox. I had thought for a while that I might put it away somewhere. I didn't have to see it. But I kept it on the shelf in Harlan's study instead, the lid up, the masking tape label facing out. For Millie. It was, in a strange way, his last piece of work. The last thing he built carefully in his deliberate, methodical, slightly too late way, and it had held. Everything he put in it had held. The criminal proceedings against my daughter-in-law moved slowly, as such things do. She was charged in the fall with 2 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of document falsification. Her attorney was competent in a way that Brant Fullerton had not been, but competence is not the same as a strong case, and the documentation Harriet had presented was, as she had described it from the beginning, a record, not a suspicion. The accounting license was formally revoked. She contested it. The board's ruling stood. My grandchildren, during the upheaval, stayed with my daughter-in-law's mother. Those children had done nothing. They would carry the weight of it regardless. I wrote each of them a letter, handwritten, with my phone number, and a simple statement that their grandmother loved them and was not going anywhere. My younger granddaughter, who was 17, called me on a Tuesday evening. "We talked for 45 minutes!" she cried. I kept my voice steady, which was one of the harder things I did that year. She came for dinner the following Sunday, ate 2 helpings of the pot roast I had made, and fell asleep on the sofa in the living room with the television on low. I put a blanket over her and turned off the lamp and stood in the dark for a moment, watching her sleep, and I thought that whatever came next, I was going to be all right. I had worried in the months after Harlan died, and before I found the box, that I was becoming someone who was simply waiting for grief to lift, waiting for the house to feel less empty, waiting to feel like myself again. What I understood now, sitting in the dark with my granddaughter asleep on the sofa, was that I had not been waiting. I had been becoming something. I didn't have a precise word for it, something more solid, something that knew its own dimensions. Harlan always said measure twice, cut once. He meant it about wood and joinery, but it was true about people too, about decisions, about knowing what something is before you commit to it. He measured twice. He just showed me the measurement too late. I didn't wait. The garden did well that summer, the tomatoes especially. I grew more than I could use and left bags of them on the porches of 3 neighbors, which Harlan would have considered an appropriate use of surplus. The dogwood, predictably, grew sideways again. I left it. June and I started walking every Tuesday and Thursday morning, something we had been meaning to do for years and had never organized. We walked the greenway along the river in the early hours when the light was still low and the path was mostly ours. We talked about our husbands, our children, about the long ordinary wisdom of lives that had been longer than we expected and harder than we planned, and in their way, richer than either of us had fully appreciated while we were in the middle of them. One morning in late July, she said, "You seem like you're back." I asked what she meant. She thought about it. "Like you know where you're standing again." I turned that over carefully for the rest of the walk, and I decided she was right. Grief had made me soft. But soft is not the same as weak. Soft things absorb pressure. They flex. They do not always break. If the person you loved left you something locked, with your name on it, go through it. You deserve to know what's on the other side. And when you find it, trust yourself enough to use it. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment, and please tell me which city you're listening from. It means something to me to know how far these words have traveled.